Okay, terrestrial ecology, this is video 4. We are starting on, this is slide 60, we're going to go to slide 83 for this video, and we're going to start talking, we're going to pick up where we left off and discuss all of the cycles, the global cycles that affect each of the biomes. So this is something that happens worldwide, all over the world, happens, impacts every single biome in pretty much the same way. And remember I talked about the fact that they're pretty much the same basic concept. You have some movement from water to land to air, to water to land to air, animals to atmosphere to soil, some combination of that for all of these cycles. So if we look at the carbon cycle first, this is a carbon cycle. You see carbon is found in almost everything, which makes a lot of sense because it's the basic for life, the basis for life on Earth, so you kind of have to have it in everything. But in the soil, in the ground, it's deep underground in coal, oil, and gas. That's where we get all of our natural gas, a lot of our energy right now. It's also found just in the soil as one of the nutrients that plants need for photosynthesis. So you move from this, in your cycle, you move from, let's start with the plants. In the plants, through respiration and decomposition, it goes up into the atmosphere. And then you have into animals, and then once it leaves animals, it hits the soil again as they decompose and comes back to the plants. You also have a couple of side shoots. You have photosynthesis going in both directions. You have decomposition happening in both places in plants and animals. It's stored in the ocean, it's stored in the atmosphere, and it's stored underground. So you have these deposits in various places. Okay, so human activities have impacted this cycle probably the most out of any of the cycles, simply because we use, especially the underground stores, the coal, oil, and natural gas, we use those to make our own energy. Those are all the fossil fuels. So using those, not only are we digging up huge amounts of land to try and find it, drilling for a whole bunch of stuff, which is a whole thing that we'll get into later. We're clearing vegetation faster than it can be replaced to get to this stuff. The impact of burning the excess, the waste products, interferes with our atmosphere, burns off our the layer at the top of our atmosphere, and that allows extra energy from the sun to come in. Global warming, global conservation, or climate change really is the better phrase now. Global climate change. So it's this whole it's this whole effect, chain reaction effect. It starts through and continues on and on and on. You can see that in the 1800s to 1900, very low use impact on the carbon cycle. The Industrial Revolution is what hit hard. That's what made everything jump. And now we're somewhere around 7 to 8 billion metric tons of fossil fuels. And you see a couple projections for the future, whether it's a low projection. This is what's hoped for based on the use of renewable energy resources and alternate sources of energy. The high projection is if we do not use those renewable resources. Okay, moving on to the phosphorus cycle. Again, you're going to see the exact same basic concept, just a little bit different picture. You see it taken up by plants. You see it fixed as phosphate in plants. Then you see it move to the animals because the animals are eating the plants. And then it comes back to the soil. So you see it cycle around and around and around from the animals to the plants to the soil and back. Can be aquatic plants, can be terrestrial plants, can be aquatic animals and terrestrial animals. You see both, all options here. You also see it used in human uses for agriculture, for fertilizer, for mining. So you see this kind of side shoot coming off. And this is the human use for that, and we'll talk more about that later in the year. So our big impact on phosphorus is fertilizer. We use huge amounts of phosphate to make fertilizer. We reduce the phosphate or the phosphorus by clearing forests. We add it to aquatic systems from runoff from animal wastes. We're going to talk about that, eutrophication, a little bit later. But this, this whole fertilizer concept, that's the key word here. When you guys hear phosphorus and nitrogen, I want you to think fertilizer, because that's the big human use. And that's the problem with it right now, is that people fertilize, crazy over fertilize, because they want bigger and better every single year. And then all that waste and that excess, the plants can only absorb so much, and all that waste and excess goes either into the groundwater, into the soil, or both, and ends up having a pretty negative impact. So the bacteria in the phosphorus cycle are not as important as the nitrogen cycle. In both cycles, it's bacteria that changes the form each time. So once the animals, die and decompose, it breaks down. The bacteria is the one that takes it from that decomposition, turns it into the form in the soil, and then turns it again into a form that the plants can use. So they're there for both, but they're not as important in the phosphorus cycle as in the nitrogen cycle. Not usually found in the atmosphere like nitrogen is. It's much slower than the nitrogen cycle is, and found more in rock and ocean sediments as opposed to like air and soil. It's usually put in fertilizers because the soil doesn't have it as much, because it's normally in rock and ocean sediments as opposed to the soil. Okay, nitrogen, again, same concept. Animals, plants to animals, back to the ground, back to the plants, back to the animals. You have this runoff again for the fertilizers. You see extra running off. You see it leaching out of the ground, turning into eutrophication. You have bacteria that's fixing all this and turning it from ammonia waste into nitrates, and back to the stuff that the plants can use. So you see this cycle, and we know now that the plants require, not only for photosynthesis, the carbon dioxide and water, but they also require these nutrients in order to really be effective and efficient at photosynthesis. Nitrogen cycle, the way that we mess with that is adding gases that contribute to acid rain, farming practices, depleting the ozone layer. Again, with the fertilizer is the big thing, contaminating the groundwater. Extra runoff turns into eutrophication. Okay, so like I said, fertilizer is having such a negative impact. Fertilizer is fixing more nitrogen than all of the natural sources combined. It is totally messing with the process. And so you see this, used to be back here, now we're up here somewhere. The nitrogen fixation is the first step where the bacteria converts it from the ammonia into the gaseous nitrogen, and the gaseous nitrogen is what the plants use. So this can be done either by cyanobacteria, which is like an algae, blue-green bacteria, or bacteria living in or on the roots of the plants. Nitrification, again, turning it into nitrate and then nitrate. It's the bacteria that's working on that. Assimilation is the plants absorbing it. So they're taking those nitrate molecules and turning them into the stuff that they need, the DNA, the amino acids, and the proteins. Ammonification is the decomposition. The bacteria breaks down from the living organisms, turns it into ammonia. And then the denitrification is where they're turned into the gases. Ions are turned into the gases. And that happens when the nutrients in the soil are broken down. And all of this is happening in bacteria. Different types of bacteria do each step of the process. So bacteria is really, really important in the nitrogen cycle. Okay, sulfur cycle. And we're going to start with the sulfur in the soil, in the atmosphere, goes up into plants, into animals, to dead stuff, and back into the soil in the atmosphere. So you see that same cycle over and over again. And then you see the human part of that over here, where you are picked up into the atmosphere, to the plants. And then you see the hydrogen sulfide gets used for industry or in volcanic activity, a whole bunch of crazy chemicals, and you see this cycle kind of offshoot over here. So the sulfur cycle, we add sulfur dioxide because we burn coal and oil. When we refine petroleum, that adds sulfur to the atmosphere. Converting into free metals releases that sulfur dioxide. That's one of the byproducts, and that releases it into the atmosphere and into the environment. So, moving on, biodiversity, many forms of life. So, you have a genetic diversity. It's the genetic makeup within a single species. It's the variety. Remember, we want a high genetic diversity that makes a healthier population and a healthier species. A species diversity is a variety of species. How many different species are on the habitats or on the earth or in that particular ecosystem or whatever you want to call it. So in general, biodiversity refers to the number of species. Like the rainforest would have a high biodiversity. It's incredibly important. It gives us the food, the wood, all of our resources, all of our natural resources are all from biodiversity. If we lose this biodiversity, we lose a lot of our resources. To test the biodiversity, we're looking at count and release, population sampling, tagging. That goes back to some of the population studies we've done in here. They can also do genetic tests to look at the genetic diversity and kind of figure out. That's very closely monitored for controlled species, especially in zoos. We can look at their genetic testing to make sure when their breeding program. The Gaia hypothesis is a suggestion that because the different forms of life control all of these cycles and have such a big impact on all of these cycles, that essentially the Earth is in and of itself a living process, that life controls the processes, the life-sustaining processes, and then some people say, no, that's too much, they don't really control it, but they do influence it. So it kind of depends on where you fall in this hypothesis. It can't really be, obviously nothing can be proven, but it can't really, there's not a lot of data necessarily in support or against it. It's kind of half and half right now, so you kind of have to choose. Do you think that the animals, eating and living and dying and reproducing and all the stuff that animals do you think that is controlling the cycles, or are the cycles controlling the animals? It kind of depends on where you fall on that chain, on that spectrum. Biomes, we're going to go through and talk about each of the different biomes. The two most important factors in a biome are the temperature and the precipitation. So that is really the determining characteristics, temperature and precipitation, the amount of rainfall. And then they tend to converge around the latitude lines on the globe. So we're looking, and that goes back to that quiz question that we had, that our previous notes kind of alluded to it, and now we're spelling it out really clearly. If you have the Earth, and we have our latitude lines. We have our equator here, and then we have, going across, we have the tropics in here, and then we have right above and right below that, we have the subtropics, the subtropical zone, and then we have a temperate zone. The lines are much straighter in real life. Temperate zone. And then we have a subpolar, and then we have a polar. And polar. So it's the same on either side, northern and southern hemisphere, with that tropics right around the globe. So there's actually a cutoff point between each of the different zones. And we're going to stop there and pick up this slide for video 5.